90.3 WHPC now presents Law You Should Know. The law affects every aspect of our lives, our home, our jobs, and our recreational activities. Now, learn about the law and how to protect yourself against the loss of your liberty or property, and learn how to stand up for your rights and seek compensation when you have been wronged. Your host for Law You Should Know is attorney Kenneth J. Landau, a past dean of the Nassau Academy of Law, and frequently lectures to lawyers on ethics and avoiding problems with clients, and to the public on how to choose and use lawyers. This is Law You Should Know on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.
Hi, this is Ken Landau, and welcome to Law You Should Know. Today we're going to discuss having a career beyond or after the law. Unfortunately, many lawyers out there, young and old, are not happy with their legal careers, and we'll explore some of the reasons why and what lawyers can do to get respite from their legal career now or plan some transition or next act in the future. And to guide us along that path is Robert Miller, and he is a past lawyer who's now found a new career for himself, and he'll tell us about his journey and give us guidance for everyone else who wishes to go on that journey. So tell us about some of the reasons why people who've studied hard might be unhappy with the law.
Well, it's a difficult career. I mean, when you start out as a young attorney after law school, if you go into a law firm, you're expected to work your rear end off, bill 2,000 hours a year. You hardly have time for almost anything else in your life. And about 10 years later, if you're lucky enough to make partner in one of the firms, now you're a junior partner. And the whole thing about that is, again, you have to bill like crazy, and you now have to develop business. So there's a tremendous amount of pressure that's put on younger lawyers and lawyers as they mature. And I also think the practice of law has changed dramatically. When I started practicing law, I graduated in 1977. I went to, unfortunately for me, I did well. So I went with one of the big Wall Street firms at that time. It was called Mudge, Rose, Guthrie, and Alexander. It was known as Nixon's former firm. And it was considered a mega firm at the time, which means that it had about 150 lawyers. Okay. Now 150 lawyers is probably considered a boutique. But back then, 150 lawyers was a lot of lawyers. And the partners there went to that firm and stayed at that firm for their entire career. There was no such thing as switching law firms and jumping around to other firms. So again, the whole practice of law has changed dramatically in that period of time.
So has it gone from bad to worse in that period of time? Whatever the negatives were for you, they've gotten so much worse for lawyers today?
I think it's even more difficult now. The mega firms are all 1,000, 2,000 lawyers. It's very anonymous, and they all have offices located all around the world. You couldn't possibly know all your partners, much less all the associates. And it's run more like a business. It's like punching a time clock and going into an office space every day. I think it's pretty difficult.
Above and beyond that, you also have to immerse yourself and devote yourself 150% to the law.
Well, that's what I found, and I'm sure it's the same nowadays. I mean, I went into the law because I had this dream that didn't work out at all, that I was going to do law during the day and play music at night, because my passion was music. And that fell by the wayside almost immediately. Frankly, it fell by the wayside when I was in law school because I didn't have enough time to do anything. So I think it's gotten worse.
And you were successful as a lawyer. Many other lawyers struggle to get a high enough paying job so they can pay back their student loans, so they can pay their bills. And those people are not happy for other reasons. And most law firms do not help their younger lawyers to achieve some type of work-life balance, to include other interests in being a lawyer or a partner in a law firm. That's not the model they experience. It's not the model they oversee today.
No, I mean, law firms are built, as you know, on this classic pyramid structure where you have a handful of partners, relatively speaking, at the top, and they make their money off of all the associates and the worker bees down below. So as long as that system exists, there's going to be tremendous pressure on everybody, but particularly the people at the lower end of the pyramid. When I graduated from law school, it really didn't cost that much money to go to law school. I didn't graduate with any student debt, and I don't know, frankly, anybody in my class that graduated with a lot of student debt. And now, of course, it's completely different. Like you said, I mean, lawyers will graduate from law school with a couple of $100,000 worth of student debt. And that's a heck of a monkey to have on your back.
And then those new lawyers, if they are accepted by a large law firm, they have to produce billable hours, and that's their life or death. Maybe they'll enjoy it, maybe they won't, but it doesn't leave too much time for other interests.
Well, you're absolutely right. I think the bogey has always been 2,000 billable hours a year. And frankly, to bill 2,000 hours a year, you've got to spend that much more time in the office because you've got administrative and non-billable and the like. And again, it's a monkey on your back to do it. One little incident kind of illustrates to me the craziness of the system. I was involved in a big bankruptcy case. That was my specialty, corporate restructurings and bankruptcy. And one particular incident, there was a letter exchange between me and the partner at another very large firm. I was not at a big firm at that moment. And his letter had 25 CCs on his letter, which means that 25 other lawyers in his firm read the letter and at least billed for the time of reading the letter, thinking about it, and maybe following up on it. It was completely unnecessary, but it's part of the syndrome that we're talking about that forces people to bill.
And so you found your life as a lawyer was bankrupt of a motive or purpose, and you decided to restructure your life.
Yeah, that's a little bit more dramatic than I would put it. Look, I call myself an accidental lawyer in the sense that I did not plan to become a lawyer. I fell into it when I was in my early 20s. What I really wanted to do all along was to play music and to do it full time and become a rock and roll star. Life got in the way. Among other things, I needed to make a living. And somebody had suggested to me, why don't you go to law school? You can do law during the day and you can play jazz at night. And I thought about it for about a nanosecond. And I said, okay, that sounds great. And that's what I wound up doing. And unfortunately, as I say, I did well in law school. And then I got this job in a big firm and I started to do well there. But I found that I didn't have room or time for almost anything else, certainly not music. And the truth is that I stopped playing music for 15 years.
And we'll talk about what happened after 15 years and how you made another transition in a moment. I just want to remind our listeners, you're listening to Law You Should Know. We're talking about having a career beyond the law, perhaps a second or later career. And our guest is Robert Miller, who's a successful musician today and did go back to his original area of interest. So tell us about how and why you did later on make that transition back to music.
Well, as I said, I always saw myself as a musician, even when I was doing the law. But I kept feeling like I was further and further away from being able to do anything about it. From time to time, I continued to keep up with the law after that 15-year hiatus. I would play a little bit here or there. I actually recorded an album or two. I had a band for a while, and we played, at different clubs in New York, etc. But it was all more like a hobby or an avocation because I was still working full time. The thing I didn't want to feel like is that people thought of me as a dilettante, that I was just this lawyer that was playing music. He's not really serious. He's not really a musician. He's just a lawyer playing music. And that stuck with me for a long time. I didn't want to have that be part of my legacy, so to speak. But it took a long time until I was ready to really give everything else up and go into the music field, which is what I always wanted to do. And I had a transition there as well. I left the law completely in 1995. Again, I was a corporate restructuring lawyer, and I had the benefit of about a 10-year run in that area where you had a whole bunch of big busted LBOs and other companies that went bankrupt. Companies like Macy's, where I represented the creditors, Trump Taj Mahal, where I represented the creditors. So from a legal perspective, it was a very nice run. And I don't dispute that or downplay it at all. And it took all the time that we've been talking about, so I didn't have anything else. But by 1995, that era was over. And I knew for me that this was a time when I could start to transition. And the first thing that I did as part of that transition, I left my law firm and I opened up a record label. It was called 32 Records. I wasn't performing on the record label. I was running a business that was a music business, but that was kind of my first way of transitioning away from the law and using my legal skills, and yet at the same time being involved in music.
So can you think of any other examples on how someone who was a lawyer in a big law firm could transition away from the law, focus on something more of interest, and use their legal background?
I think it happens all the time. I think lawyers leave firms. In fact, when I was at the big law firm that I mentioned, I think the average stay for most lawyers was about 3 years. And that's what it was for me, too. Very few actually take the run and say, this is what I want to do with my entire life. And a lot of lawyers will leave the law and they'll, one of the things they do is they go with corporate clients. They go in-house. Some go and teach. Now, that's all still within the law. But the benefit of a legal background and legal training is that it teaches you to think in a most critical fashion. And I think there are a lot of businesses and a lot of avocations that will benefit from having that kind of thinking ability. And I think that's more than anything else where ex-lawyers can look to for a second career.
Can you just expand on that a bit? What professions maybe lawyers are most conducive to having a former lawyer working for them or working in them?
Well, one of the things you can do is to go into finance, okay? All the big Wall Street firms, and I'm talking about the financial firms, they have all different nooks and crannies, investing, LBOs, IPOs, etc. And a legal training is extremely helpful in all of those areas. Again, it's critical thinking. It's knowing how to avoid conflicts and problems and lawsuits. It's kind of a resolution type of mentality. I found when I went into the music business, when I opened up my label, that my legal background was unbelievably helpful. I had to negotiate all different kinds of contracts with vendors, suppliers, artists, distributors, etc. And for me, it was like, second nature. So I had no issues there whatsoever. And I think that, again, legal training, if you think about it, there's almost an infinite amount of possibilities as to where you can go with that.
So you could go into a nonprofit, you could go into government, you could deal with some institution that deals with the arts or nonprofit or, environmental, something else that can utilize your legal skills, but maybe a cause you feel is more in line with your values.
Yes, and you don't have to be a lawyer in that other profession to utilize your skill set in that profession. So all of those things that you mentioned are all realistic possibilities.
Now, you told us your dream was to play music full time, which you have achieved, and you'll tell us about a little later. But tell us about the acronym DREAM that people can use and think about in judging the journey.
For me, again, it was always my dream to do what I'm doing now, which is music full time. And I will discuss that, as you said, in a few minutes. But one of the things that I said to myself after having achieved a certain success for myself in that transition into music was, how can I help other people? What is it that I can impart from my journey? And I came up with the acronym DREAM. I said, okay, let's go through that. D is obviously dream, meaning you have to have a dream. Everybody starts out with a dream. There's very few people that in their teens say, my dream is to become an accountant. Okay, or a lawyer, probably, for that matter.
So it may be in your deep unconsciousness down there, because you may have forgotten it through law school and college, but it's down there. So you should think about what your dream is.
Exactly. Yeah, I mean, people, if you ask a kid, what do you want to be when they grow up? What do they say? I want to be an astronaut. I want to be the mayor of New York City. They dream big. Okay. And that's the way you should when you're younger.
And if they say corporate lawyer, then there's a problem.
Then I would immediately send that kid to a psychiatrist. Okay.
Okay, let's move on with dream. So tell us about the R.
The R. The R stands for realistic. The dream has to be realistic. I mean, for example, if you're in your mid-50s and you say, I want to be a pitcher in professional baseball, unless you're Satchel Paige, it's probably not a realistic dream. Okay? So there are dreams that are just pie in the sky. I want to be an astronaut and I'm, 80 years old. And there are dreams that are much more realistic. I want to open up a business. I always wanted to study such and such. I always wanted to go on a trip around the world, etc. R is important. It's got to be a realistic dream. E, to me, is the most important part of the whole acronym because it stands for execute. You need to execute an action plan. For almost everything in life, I think you need an action plan, a plan that says, how do I get from A to Z? What are the steps that I need to take? Of course, that's going to differ with each dream and with each end result that you're trying to achieve. But you must have or be able to visualize an action plan, baby steps, getting us from step one to the end. A is for adjust. There is no dream that goes from A to Z without any changes, without any consequences. I like to quote Mike Tyson, who said, everybody's got a plan of action until they get hit in the face. Okay? So my point is that your plan has to change and adjust as time and circumstances go on. And M is for measure. How do you measure success? Every dream, every final plan will have a different end result that requires a different measurement for success. So for me, being in music, it was the amount of music that I was able to write. It was the amount of music that I was able to record. It was the response of the audience to my music. It was being able to play concerts and festivals in all different places, etc. So I was able to say, okay, how am I doing and how am I measuring up against my goals? And frankly, you can set everything in place, but if you go through the process of trying to achieve your dream, not everybody is going to succeed.
And I just want to mention also, in terms of realistic, sometimes you might need to take a career test or see a career consultant to explore what your inner, what brings you joy and what skill set you might have to move a little further to that transition. And it may not be a complete transition. It may be just to put some of that in your life balance.
I agree with you. At the end of the day, what are we trying to achieve from all of this? And you put your finger on it a moment ago. There's a certain joy and happiness and satisfaction that comes from doing what you really want to do. And even more so, achieving success at what your dream is. That's the thing that I would say to a lawyer or anybody else. If you love the law, if you love practicing law, if you love going into courtrooms and beating up on people every day, if that's what really turns you on, then that's great. That's your dream. Stick with it. But there are plenty of lawyers and others that just kind of fell into an area of practice, or they're doing something out of rote that they never really loved, And it's for those people that I would say, at some point, examine what turns you on, what makes you happy.
And in law or in bar association activities, you may have met contacts outside the law who can also give you guidance and give you some opportunities to transition yourself a little bit, even if it's on a voluntary basis, just so you can have a more full life and a greater enjoyment of life.
Yes, and you don't have to transition completely. I mean, for example, if you're a musician like I was, and you're not playing music because you just didn't have the time and you gave it up or whatever, there are all kinds of community bands, orchestras, glee clubs, etc., that you could potentially join so that, okay, now you've worked it back into your life. So it's not 100% law and zero for everything else. You've got that, kind of law-work balance that, or work-play balance that you alluded to at the beginning.
And do you have to work out a transition plan with your law firm, with your family, with your friends?
Well, unless you want to get sued, I would recommend that you work out a plan. Certainly, if you're a partner in a law firm, you can't just walk out the door the next day. You've got responsibilities to your clients. You have responsibilities to your partners, and frankly, what I would do is sit down with them and tell them, this is what I want to do. I want to go for such and such. This has been my dream. I want to transition out. The first reaction on their part is going to be extreme jealousy because they probably harbor the same ambitions as you do, maybe in a different area. But it happens enough that I think if you're responsible and do it in the right way, you'll be able to figure out the answers here.
And sometimes you might be able to change your workload or change your area of practice within the firm to dovetail with your career interest as a step along the path.
I guess that's possible. I think today the law is so limiting in the sense that everybody has to have a specialty. There's no such thing as general practice anymore. So being able to say, I'm going to transition from this specialty to that specialty, if you can do it, terrific. But I think that's also pretty difficult.
Okay, I just want to remind our listeners, we're talking with Robert Miller. He is involved in music now, but he was a former lawyer, and he's been talking to us about having a dream career beyond the law. And Robert, now you've landed, you're doing what you enjoy. Tell us about that final transition and how you've succeeded in music.
I was in my early 60s when it hit me that it was now or never for me. I had been playing music, but not at the level and not in the way that I wanted to. And I said, I have to change that. And I jumped in the deep end of the pool. I gave everything else up. And I decided I was going to do music full time. And the first thing I did was I restructured the band that I had formed several years earlier called Project Grand Slam. And I brought in at that time a bunch of young, extremely talented, mainly foreign-born musicians that had all come to New York to kind of make their mark. I wanted their youth, their vitality, their talent. And as it turned out, a number of them were from Latin American countries. And I used that Latin American background in my music. I found that as I got into this more and more, my writing exploded. Previously, I had kind of a mental block. I could write songs, but it didn't flow freely. Since the time, and it's only been 5 years that I made this big transition, I've written about 100 songs that we've recorded. I've moved the band more and more into the vocal area because I believe that, number one, people love vocals, and number two, I have a wonderful singer that is able to take my songs and really deliver them the way that I would want them to. And the band has evolved into a kind of rock jazz fusion with a twist of Latin. So pretty unique. And it's allowed us to make our mark and kind of not compete directly. I mean, we're not going to be the next Taylor Swift or Katy Perry. I don't try and pass us off or myself off as a 20-year-old, which is where most of the industry is. I do my thing and I do it at my level. And guess what? There's enough people, particularly in the baby boomer area, that love the same kind of music that I love, which comes out of the 60s. And therefore, I have a big audience, but it's not a teenage audience. It's a more mature, older audience.
And tell us the website for your band.
Okay, the two things I would mention are the mothership, so to speak, is projectgrandslam.com. The name of the band is Project Grand Slam. And for your listeners on this show, I have a special gift. And that is if you go to our store, which is called thepgsstore.com, I'm going to give a free digital album of our latest album called East Side Sessions to everybody that asks for it. And all they have to do is when they check out, enter the code DREAM, DREAM, and they'll get a free album. So they'll get a chance to hear us and hopefully make their lives that much better.
And do you have any final thoughts or suggestions for anyone on their journey, trying to, even if they've had a full career, if they can't stand the law and they want to go to Plan B earlier?
Well, look, I think I'm living proof that you're never too old and it's never too late and there's never an impediment to following your dream if that's what you want to do. So you don't have to be in your 60s like I was. You can be much younger. I would, again, try and get in touch with your inner self. What really makes you happy? And, at this time when we're in a pandemic, I think there's two things that a lot of us have in common. Number one, we all have a lot more time on our hands. So it's thinking time as well as everything else. And secondly, if you're anything like me, the pandemic has made you at least think about, if not get in touch with your mortality. I mean, we don't know how this is going to end for each of us. Thank goodness that so many people have not been affected by it. But with 280,000 people dead at this point, you just never know. So I say to myself, okay, if there's ever a time to think about doing what really makes you happy, this is the time.
And it's true, just putting it in your mix of activities, making it part of your life. So at least that might bring you more joy and more satisfaction than the law or business or work part of your life.
Yeah.
Okay, I would I
made a complete break, but you don't have to make a complete break.
Okay. I'd like to thank Robert Miller from ProjectGrandSlam.com for being our guest and telling us about how to have a dream career beyond the law, and it could be beyond business or anything else. If you missed any part of the broadcast or you want to listen to the podcast or tell someone about it, it's available at nccradio.org. And thank you for listening to Law You Should Know here on 90.3 FM, the voice of Nassau Community College in Garden City, New York. And please join us next week at this same time for another program on Law You Should Know.